The house at the end of Cypress Lane was the only thing I could afford after the divorce. A hulking Victorian silhouette against the perpetual gray sky of this forgotten town. The realtor's key was cold and heavy in my hand, and the front door groaned open on hinges that protested with a sound like a tired old animal. The air inside was still and carried the scent of old wood and something else. Something dry and papery like fallen leaves in a closed room. I didn't notice the rules right away. I was too busy hauling in my meager boxes, feeling the vast empty spaces swallow the echoes of my footsteps. It was only after I'd slumped onto the bare floorboards of the main living area, my back against the wall, that I felt the ridges against my shoulder blades. I shifted and turned, squinting in the weak afternoon light filtering through the grimy bay window. And that's when I saw them. They weren't written on paper or pinned to a board. They were carved directly into the plaster of the wall. Neat, deep grooves, filled with what looked like old, darkened wax, as if the words had been sealed in place a long time ago. The writing was precise but strangely fluid. Not the blocky letters of a tool, but something more organic. I ran my fingers over the grooves, and a chill completely unrelated to the temperature traced my spine. The first rule was simple enough. Never acknowledge the reflections in the windows after sundown. If you see movement, close the curtains and turn on the radio to the static station. Do not look back until morning. I laughed, a dry, hollow sound in the empty house. Some previous owner's idea of a joke, a bit of creepy theater for the new occupant. I got up and continued unpacking. But as dusk began to bleed into the room, painting long, distorted shadows from the furniture I'd brought, I found myself glancing at the blackening panes of glass, seeing only the dim outline of the room behind me. I shook my head at my own nerves. I was a grown man, not a child spooked by campfire stories. The second rule was near the fireplace. The fireplace may be used, but only with wood you have split yourself. Never use manufactured logs. The scent of pine is acceptable. The scent of cherry is a warning. The scent of salt means you have already made a mistake. The third was by the door to the basement, a door that was sealed shut with 3 heavy bolts. The basement door must remain bolted at all times. You will hear knocking. Sometimes it will sound like a person, sometimes like a branch tapping, sometimes like your own heartbeat. You may answer only if the knocking matches the rhythm of the song 3 Times a Lady by the Commodores. Use the peephole first. If you see green, open the door. If you see brown, go to your bedroom and stay until you hear the morning birds. I didn't know that song. I made a mental note to never learn it. The rules continued throughout the house, each one more bizarre than the last. In the kitchen, a rule about always leaving a cup of water on the counter overnight and pouring it down the sink before drinking any yourself. In the hallway, an instruction to count the doors twice before going to sleep. And if the number was odd, to sleep in the bathtub with the shower curtain closed. In the master bedroom, a lengthy carving about the closet. The closet is for storage, but nothing made of wool. If you place wool inside, you will feel a tugging on your clothes throughout the next day. This tugging will grow stronger until it is no longer a tug. Check the closet every Tuesday. If you find a single black thread, burn it immediately using a match, not a lighter. The smoke will smell of lavender. This is good. I spent that first night in a fitful sleep on my mattress on the floor, the rules swirling in my head, every creak of the old house jolting me awake. I told myself it was all nonsense, the remnants of a superstitious owner. Maybe someone with mental health problems, but the precision of the carvings, the sheer effort it must have taken, it gnawed at me. Days passed. I settled into a routine. I deliberately ignored the rules. I used a fake log in the fireplace. It crackled with blue and green chemicals and filled the room with a synthetic perfume. I left no water on the counter. I slept in my bed regardless of my door count, which was always 7, an odd number, I guess, but I didn't care. Nothing happened. The house was just a house, quiet, a little drafty, but mine. Then the small things began. The morning after I used the fake log, I woke to the faint, unmistakable smell of sea air in the living room, a briny, salty odor that had no place miles from the coast. It clung to the curtains for hours. I dismissed it as a fluke. Maybe a neighbor's weird cooking. A few nights later, I was up late reading, and from the corner of my eye, I saw a shape move in the dark window. Not a reflection of me, but something taller, thinner, swaying slightly. I froze, the book heavy in my lap. I remembered Rule 1, don't acknowledge it. I forced my eyes back to the page, but my skin was crawling. I could feel a pressure, a silent attention focused on the back of my neck. I got up, my movements stiff, and walked to the window. I didn't look at the glass. I just yanked the curtains shut. The fabric was thick and dusty. I then turned on the old radio I'd found in a cupboard. I spun the dial until I found a spot of pure, hissing static and turned the volume up. The white noise filled the room, a chaotic, mindless sound, and as it did, the feeling of being watched faded like a tide going out. I stood there in the center of the room, surrounded by the static, and for the first time, I felt a real, deep fear, not of monsters under the bed, but of the rules themselves. They weren't just instructions, they were a manual for survival, and I had been ignoring it. The next day, I began to follow them, not out of belief, but out of a growing, primal caution. I split wood in the backyard, my hands blistering on the axe handle. The real fire smelled of pine and was comforting. I left the cup of water out. I counted the doors, 7, always 7. So I began sleeping in the bathtub on those nights, curled uncomfortably on the cold porcelain. The worst was the basement door. The knocking started a week after I moved in. It was soft at first, a tentative tap 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 that I mistook for the house settling. But it grew more persistent. It came at irregular intervals, sometimes in the middle of the day, sometimes deep in the night. It never sounded like a branch or a heartbeat. It always sounded like a person, a polite, patient person asking to be let in. I never went near it. I just made sure the bolts were firmly slid across. One Tuesday, checking the closet as the rule dictated, I saw it. A single, long black thread lying coiled on the floor like a tiny snake. My breath hitched. I fumbled for a match from the box I'd bought. My hands trembling, I struck it, the flare of light and sulfur smell startling in the dim closet. I touched the flame to the thread. It didn't burn like normal thread. It curled and blackened instantly, vanishing into a wisp of smoke that carried a sweet, clear scent of lavender. The smell was so strong and so pleasant, it made my eyes water. I sank to the floor, the spent match between my fingers, the reality of the situation crashing down on me. The house was not just strange, it was alive with parameters, with conditions, and I was now its caretaker. Whether I wanted to be or not, life became a ritual. I lived by the wax-filled words on the walls. The days blurred into a cycle of small, precise actions designed to keep the uneasy peace. The knocking at the basement door became a constant backdrop, sometimes fading for days, sometimes raging into a frantic pounding that made the dishes in the kitchen cabinet rattle. I never heard the song. I never looked through the peephole. I started to dream. Not normal dreams, but vivid, walking dreams where I'd find myself standing in the hallway, facing the basement door. In the dream, the bolts would be undone, and a deep, resonant humming would come from the other side, a sound that vibrated in my teeth. I'd wake up in the bathtub, or in my bed, with the taste of old metal in my mouth. The rules kept me safe, but they also kept me prisoner. I couldn't have guests. How would I explain the cup of water, or the mandatory Tuesday closet inspection, or why I sometimes slept in the tub? I grew thin and jumpy. My world shrunk into the walls of the house on Cypress Lane. I began to talk to the house, muttering under my breath as I performed my tasks. "Just getting your water," I'd say, or "nice pine fire tonight." It felt less lonely that way, and sometimes the house would respond, not with words, but with sensations, a sudden warmth in a cold corner after I'd correctly burned a black thread, a particularly vicious series of knocks if I was late with my evening door count. It was a relationship, a terrible, codependent relationship. The turning point came on a cold, moonless night. I had followed all the rituals perfectly. The pine fire was dying to embers. The water cup was full. The doors had been counted twice. 7. So I was preparing my nest of blankets in the bathtub. I was exhausted, a deep soul weariness from the constant vigilance. And in my fatigue, I made a mistake as I passed the hallway mirror. A family piece my ex-wife didn't want. I caught my own reflection. I looked gaunt, older, my eyes hollow, and then I saw something else behind me. In the dark reflection of the living room, a shape was leaning over the back of the sofa. It was long and willowy, with limbs that seemed too many and too jointed. It wasn't looking at me. It was looking at the cup of water on the counter. I broke Rule 1. I acknowledged it. I gasped, a sharp intake of breath, and in the mirror, the thing's head rotated slowly, smoothly, until it was facing my reflected self. It had no face, just a smooth, pale oval. But I felt its regard like a physical weight. Panic seized me. I tore my eyes away from the mirror and ran to the living room. The room was empty, the sofa undisturbed, but the cup of water was gone. In its place was a small, damp spot on the countertop. The air smelled like wet soil and ozone. The radio. Rule 1 said to turn on the radio. I stumbled to it, my fingers slipping on the dial. I couldn't find the static. Every station was clear, playing old love songs, talk radio, everything but the soothing hiss I desperately needed. The knocking on the basement door began. Not the polite tap, but the frantic, pounding rhythm. Boom, 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 boom. It was relentless. I fell to my knees in front of the radio, spinning the dial, tears of frustration and terror in my eyes. Finally, a burst of static erupted from the speaker. So loud it hurt my ears, I cranked the volume up. The pounding on the basement door stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was worse. It was a thick, listening silence. I stayed there on the floor, wrapped in the noise, until the first gray light of dawn edged the curtains. That morning, I found a new carving. It wasn't on the wall with the others. It was on the floorboards right in front of the sealed basement door. The wax was fresh, pale and soft. The letters jagged as if carved in haste. The balance is broken. The water was taken, not given. You looked when you should not see. One chance remains, at the true midnight, when the house holds its breath. You must go down. You must meet the tenant. You must offer a trade. There was no further instruction, no guide, just that terrifying imperative. I was supposed to open the door. I was supposed to go into the basement, the one place the original rules absolutely forbade. The day passed in a slow-motion nightmare. I tried to think of a way out, but the house felt different, heavier. The air was dense and expectant. The reflections in the windows were just my own, but they seemed to lag a half-second behind my movements. As I paced, I knew there was no choice. The rules had been my shield, and I had broken them. Now I faced the consequence. True midnight. I didn't know what that meant. But as the evening deepened, I felt a shift, a deepening quiet that went beyond the absence of sound. It was like the house was drawing in on itself. At 11:30, the familiar static station on the radio dissolved into silence. Then a single, clear piano note played, and then nothing more. The knocking started again. This time, it was slow, deliberate. A knock, then a long pause, another knock, another pause. It was counting down. I stood before the basement door, my hand on the cold top bolt, my heart hammering against my ribs. I didn't know the song. I wasn't going to use the peephole. The last knock came, and in its aftermath, the absolute stillness was deafening. This was it. The house was holding its breath. I slid the bolts back. The sound was monstrously loud in the silence. The door did not swing open. I had to pull it. The hinges screamed. Beyond was darkness. Not just an absence of light, but a solid, velvety blackness that seemed to swallow the hallway light. A smell wafted up, cold stone, damp earth, and that dried, papery leaf smell from my first day. I took a step down, then another. The wooden stairs groaned under my weight. As my head descended below the level of the hallway floor, the door behind me swung shut with a soft, final click. I was in utter black. I could see nothing. I could only feel the rough wooden rail under my sweating hand and hear my own ragged breathing. I counted 15 steps before my foot found level ground. The air was much colder down here. I stood, frozen, waiting for my eyes to adjust. They didn't. The darkness was complete, and then a light kindled. It was a soft, greenish phosphorescence that seemed to come from the walls themselves, revealing a large, low-ceilinged cellar. It was not empty. The walls were lined with shelves, but they held no jars or boxes. Instead, they held collections. On one shelf were dozens of cups, mugs, and glasses, each one containing a tiny residue of liquid. My missing water cup was there. On another shelf were bundles of black thread, neatly tied. On a third were pieces of wood, a chip of pine, a sliver of cherry, a block of salt-encrusted driftwood. In the center of the room was a chair, and in the chair sat the tenant. It was the shape from the window, the thing from the mirror. It was tall, and its limbs were folded in a way that seemed impossible. Its smooth, faceless head was tilted, regarding me. It was not made of flesh. It seemed constructed of the same stuff as the house. Old wood, plaster, shadow. I could see the grain of wood in its long arms, the crack of old paint on its torso. It was the house, or the house was it. I understood then. The rules weren't for keeping things out. They were for keeping this thing, this consciousness, content, pacified with its little rituals and collections. I had failed in my maintenance, and now I was the offering. I had nothing to trade. I was empty. The thing unfolded one long arm, a limb that creaked like a floorboard. It pointed a finger that was more like a smooth dowel rod. Not at me, but past me, to a bare section of the stone wall. I turned, and there, new words were forming in the stone, not carved, but emerging as if the rock itself was flowing like wax. A trade, the words wrote themselves. A memory for a memory. Leave one, take one, the balance returns. It wanted a piece of me, not my body, but my past, my mind. What could I give? What would it want? I thought of my marriage, the slow, painful unraveling, the quiet dinners full of silence, the last argument in our bright kitchen. I didn't want that memory. It was a wound, but it was mine. I looked at the tenant, its blank face, and I nodded. I closed my eyes and focused on that memory. The feeling of the cold kitchen tile under my feet, the sound of my own voice breaking, the terrible finality of the front door closing. I pushed it out of me, towards that silent presence. When I opened my eyes, the tenant's head was bowed. For a moment, a shimmer hung in the air between us, a faint image of that last moment. Then it dissipated. The thing's hand moved again, and this time it pointed at my chest. A coldness seeped into me, not unpleasant, but deep. And with it came a memory that was not mine. I saw a man, a previous owner from maybe a century ago. He was carving the first rule into the wall with a chisel. His face was grim, determined. He was not afraid. He was making a deal. He was setting the terms for coexistence. The memory was clear. The smell of the plaster dust, the ache in his wrist, the resolution in his heart to outlast the thing in his cellar, to give it order so it would not take chaos. The memory settled into my mind, foreign but now a part of my history. The tenant lowered its arm. The greenish light began to fade. I understood. The trade was done. I turned and fumbled my way back up the stairs in the growing dark. The door opened easily at my touch. I stumbled into the hallway and slammed it shut. Bolting all 3 locks with trembling hands, I leaned against it, gasping. The house around me felt different, lighter. The oppressive weight was gone. The next morning, the new carving on the floor was gone, as if it had never been. The rules on the walls remained, the wax dark and old, I resumed my duties. But now it was different. I wasn't a prisoner following insane instructions out of fear. I was a caretaker, a warden. I had taken a memory of purpose, and I had left a memory of pain. The balance was restored. The tenant was quiet. The knocking became rare and only ever sounded like a branch tapping in the wind. I still live here. I follow the rules, not because I have to, but because I choose to. It's my job now. I am the guardian of the strange house on Cypress Lane, and some nights, when I'm adding a particularly fragrant piece of pine to the fire, I can almost feel a sense of approval, a quiet creak of contentment in the old bones of the place. We have an understanding, the house, the tenant, and me. And as long as the rules are kept, we will all stay just as we are.